The Dust of Desolation, the Legend of Bodhi. In most places, time is a river that washes everything away. In Bodhi, time is a desert wind that simply buries the truth under a layer of glass and arsenic. The Curse of the High Sierra. The wind doesn't just blow in the eastern Sierra, it screams. It carries the scent of sagebrush and the metallic tang of dreams that went sour a century ago. In 1859, W.S. Bodey stared into a pan of freezing creek water and saw a glimmer that would change the map of California. He found gold. But the mountains are jealous gods. Bodey died in a blizzard less than a year later, never seeing the town that would bear his name, misspelled by a sign painter, a fitting start for a place defined by beautiful mistakes. By 1879, Bodey wasn't just a mining camp, it was a sea of sin. It was a city of 10,000 souls perched at 8,379 feet, where the air was too thin for morals, but just right for madness. The Bad Man of Bodey. If you walked down Main Street in 1880, you didn't look men in the eye unless you were ready to draw. The Bad Man of Bodey wasn't one person, it was a collective spirit. With 65 saloons, the town boasted a murder a day. The local newspaper, the Bodey Daily Free Press, ran a morning obituaries column that was often longer than the weather report. One night, a young girl was told by her family they were moving to the booming gold town. That night, she wrote in her diary a sentence that became a legend across the American West. "Goodbye, God, I'm going to Bodey." But the town wasn't just violence, it was a marvel of Victorian engineering. While San Francisco was still flickering in gaslight, Bodey was one of the first towns in the world to be electrified. Massive stamps in the mills crushed quartz 24 hours a day, a rhythmic thumping that sounded like the heartbeat of a greedy giant. The frozen moment. What makes Bodey astounding to the modern American traveler isn't just its rise, but its eerie, sudden stillness. Unlike other ghost towns that were torn down for lumber, Bodey was abandoned in a state of arrested decay. When the gold ran out and the fires of 1932 gutted the business district, people simply left. Today, if you peer through the wavy, hand-blown glass of the general store, you will see boxes of Kellogg's cornflakes from the 1920s still sitting on the shelves. In the schoolhouse, McGuffey readers lie open on dust-caked desks. In the morgue, there are coffins, both adult-sized and tragically small, stacked against the wall, waiting for occupants who moved away 80 years ago. The Curse of the Artifacts. There is a supernatural lore that haunts the park rangers of Bodey today. It's called the Bodie Curse. Every year, the park office receives dozens of anonymous packages. Inside are pebbles, nails, or shards of glass taken by tourists as souvenirs. Accompanying them are frantic letters. "Since I took this square nail, my car broke down, my wife left me, and my house flooded. Please put it back." The land refuses to be divided. It demands to remain whole. A skeletal monument to the era of the gold standard and the rugged individualism that built the United States. The Standard Mill and the Alchemy of the West. To understand Bodey, you have to understand the Standard Consolidated Mine. This wasn't just a hole in the ground, it was a subterranean labyrinth that produced nearly $15 million in gold at 19th century prices. Inside the mill, the noise was absolute. The stamps, massive iron pistons weighing over 1,000 pounds, fell day and night, crushing rock into powder. It was a brutal, industrial symphony that could be heard for miles across the high desert. but it was also a place of high science. Miners used liquid mercury to pull the gold from the dust, creating an amalgam that was then heated in retorts. The process was toxic, the labor was backbreaking, and the air was thick with silica dust. Many men who sought their fortune in the Golden City found only miner's consumption, or silicosis, and an early grave in the cemetery on the hill. The night the sky turned red. By the early 1930s, Bodie was a shadow of its former self, but it was still inhabited. Then came June 23, 1932. It started with a single boy playing with matches in a backyard. In the high, dry altitude of the Sierra, wood becomes like tinder. Within an hour, a wall of flame was roaring through the Victorian storefronts. The town's fire engine, a relic even then, broke down. The water pressure failed. Witnesses described the scene as apocalyptic. Families fled into the sagebrush hills, watching as the luxury hotels, the grand dance halls, and the pride of the West turned into embers. When the sun rose the next morning, 90% of Bodie was gone. What survived was a miracle of geography. A few blocks of houses, the Methodist church, the schoolhouse, and the jail stood untouched, separated from the inferno by a shift in the wind. This is the Bodie we see today, a fraction of a ghost, a remnant of a disaster. The Guardians of Silence. Bodie didn't officially become a state park until 1962. In the 30 years between the fire and its protection, it was a private ghost town. A man named James S. Kane, who had stayed when everyone else left, became the self-appointed protector of the ruins. Kane patrolled the streets with a shotgun, guarding the history of his neighbors. He refused to let scavengers take the furniture or the books. Because of his stubbornness, the town remained intact. When you walk through the town today, you aren't walking through a museum. You are walking through a crime scene where the criminal was time itself. You can still see the pool table in the Miners' Union Hall, the felt torn and faded, but the balls still sitting in the pockets as if the players just stepped out for a smoke and never came back. The voices in the sagebrush. Ask any park ranger who has lived in the employee housing at Bodie, and they will tell you you are never truly alone. It isn't just the curse of the stolen rocks, it's the sounds. At night, when the wind dies down, people report hearing the faint tinkling of a piano from the long, burnt-down saloons. Others see the woman in white peering from the upper window of the Kane house. Perhaps it's just the wind whistling through the cracks in the weathered wood, or the expansion of the tin roofs under the moonlight. But in a place where the clocks stopped a century ago, it's easy to believe that some spirits simply refuse to leave the party. The lessons of the dust. Bodie is a uniquely American story. It represents the boom and bust cycle that defines much of the nation's history. It's a story of extreme wealth, extreme violence, and eventually extreme silence. It reminds us that nothing, not even a city built on gold and powered by the latest technology, is permanent. The sagebrush eventually wins. The mountain always takes back what was borrowed. The angel of Bodie and the outcasts of the hill. To understand the heart of Bodie, you have to leave the main street and walk up the hill to the cemetery. In the 1880s, even in death, Bodie was segregated. There was the respectable cemetery with its iron fences and marble headstones, and then there was the Boot Hill, a patch of rocky earth for the gamblers, the outlaws, and the women of the night. But one grave sits in a place of unique honor. It belongs to Evelyn Myers, known to history as the Angel of Bodie. Evelyn wasn't a socialite or a rich man's wife. She was a woman who ran a boarding house. But during the brutal winter of 1878, when the Bodey bug, a lethal pneumonia, swept through the town, she became a saint. While doctors fled or overcharged, Evelyn moved from shack to shack with hot soup and clean bandages. She didn't care if you were a millionaire mine owner or a penniless laborer. When she finally succumbed to exhaustion and illness, the town did something unprecedented. Every mine closed for a day. The saloons went silent. A procession of thousands followed her casket up the hill. Even the bad men took off their hats. In a town built on greed, Evelyn proved that humanity could survive at 8,000 feet. The forbidden fragrance of Chinatown. Just outside the main residential area lay Bodie's Chinatown. At its peak, hundreds of Chinese immigrants lived here, providing the backbone of the town's infrastructure. They were the wood haulers, the laundrymen, and the cooks. But Chinatown was a world apart. It was a place of opium dens and Taoist shrines where the air smelled of sandalwood and roasted duck, a sharp contrast to the smell of horse manure and cheap whiskey on Main Street. The Chinese residents faced intense racism. They were forbidden from working inside the mines, so they took the jobs no one else wanted. Yet, without them, Bodie would have frozen. In the winters, when the snow was 20 feet deep and the stagecoaches couldn't reach the town, it was the Chinese wood peddlers who hauled sagebrush and timber on their backs to keep the boilers running. Today, all that remains of Chinatown are mounds of broken pottery and the glint of medicinal tiger bone bottles in the dirt, tiny fragments of a culture that kept a Western giant alive. The 13-mile miracle, the world's first power line. Bodie wasn't just about pickaxes, it was a pioneer of the future. By the 1990s, the nearby forests had been stripped bare for fuel. The mines were dying because they couldn't power the mills. The solution was a gamble that changed the world. An engineer named Leggett proposed building a hydroelectric plant on Green Creek, 13 miles away. At the time, experts said it was impossible. They believed electricity couldn't travel that far in a straight line without dissipating. But the people of Bodie were desperate. They built the line in a perfectly straight path, literally over mountains and through canyons, because they believed any curve would leak the electricity out. When they flipped the switch in 1892, the Standard Mill roared to life. It was the first long-distance transmission of high-voltage electricity in the world. Bodie had beaten the great cities of Europe and New York to the future. For a brief moment, this dusty, violent outpost was the most technologically advanced spot on Earth. The echo of the schoolhouse bell. Perhaps the most haunting building in Bodie today is the schoolhouse. Through the windows, you can see a globe of the world from the 1920s, a map where many countries have names that no longer exist. There is a story of a teacher, Miss Miller, who taught there during the town's decline. She described the children as wise beyond their years. Growing up in Bodie meant knowing the sound of a gunshot and the silence of a funeral by the age of 6. On the final day the school was open in the early 1940s, the children left their books on their desks expecting to return on Monday, but the mine shut down over the weekend. The families packed what they could fit in their cars and vanished. The books stayed. They are still there, the pages yellowing and curling in the dry mountain air, holding the lessons of a generation that the world forgot. The modern sentinel. Today, Bodie is managed by California State Parks. The philosophy is arrested decay. They don't fix the peeling paint, they don't straighten the leaning walls. If a roof falls in, they stabilize it exactly where it landed. The rangers who live there year-round are a special breed. They endure winters where the temperature drops to negative 30 degrees Fahrenheit. They live in a place where the nearest grocery store is over an hour away. They are the guardians of a ghost. One ranger tells a story of a night in December. He was walking past the old Methodist church when he saw a light in the window. Thinking it was a trespasser, he drew his flashlight and burst inside. The church was empty. The air was still, but on the altar, a single Bible was open to the book of Revelations. There was no wind. There was no one there. Why Bodie matters. Bodie is more than a tourist trap. It is a mirror. It shows us the American spirit in its rawest form, the courage to build something out of nothing, the greed that destroys it, and the eerie beauty of what remains when the humans are gone. As you drive away down the washboard dirt road, leaving the dust of Bodie behind, you can't help but look in your rearview mirror. The town seems to shimmer in the heat haze, looking for all the world like it might just wake up again. The stamps might start thumping, and the bad man might step back onto the porch for one last showdown. The veins of the earth, secrets of the deep. Below the dusty streets of Bodie lies a world darker than any nightmare. While the town flourished in the sun, thousands of men spent their lives in the labyrinth. The tunnels beneath the Standard and Lent mines stretched for miles, a cold, damp spiderweb of timber and rock. These tunnels were silent witnesses to the greatest tragedies. In the 1880s, a cave-in at the 700-foot level trapped 6 miners. For 3 days, the townspeople stood at the mine shaft, listening to the rhythmic tapping on the iron pipes, a desperate Morse code from the belly of the mountain. By the time rescuers broke through, the tapping had stopped. They found the men sitting in a circle, their candles burned down to nothing. To this day, urban explorers and historians claim that if you put your ear to the dry earth near the Standard Mill, you can still hear that rhythmic tapping, the Tommyknockers, or the ghosts of the trapped, forever trying to signal the surface. The paper trail of broken hearts. When the last families fled Bodie, they didn't just leave furniture, they left their souls in the form of paper. In the 1950s, a researcher found a trunk in the attic of a collapsing Victorian house. Inside were letters from a woman named Sarah to her husband, who had come to Bodie to strike it rich. The letters chart a devastating descent from hope to despair. 1877, "Send for us soon, Thomas. The children miss their father." 1879, "We are here, but the cold is like a knife. Why is the whiskey cheaper than milk?" 1881, "The mine has taken your lungs. I am selling the silver spoons to pay the doctor." The final letter was never mailed. It was tucked into a Bible stained with tears and dust. These documents, now preserved in the California State Archives, remind us that Bodie wasn't just a place of outlaws, it was a place of families who gambled their lives on a yellow rock and lost. The battle for the bones of Bodie. The transition from a dying town to a National Historic Landmark was not a peaceful one. In the 1940s and 50s, Bodie was a lawless no-man's land. Scavengers from all over the West descended like vultures. They tore down buildings for the weathered barnwood and stole original Victorian wallpaper. The Kane family, who still held the deeds to much of the land, fought a private war to save the town. They hired armed guards to patrol the perimeter. There are legends of high-speed car chases on the dirt roads between rangers and looters carrying crates of ghost town antiques. If not for this stubborn, almost violent protection, Bodie would be a flat patch of sagebrush today. It exists because a handful of people believed that the failure of a town was just as important to preserve as the success of a city like San Francisco. Midnight at the DeChambeau House. For the park rangers who live in Bodie today, the ghosts are just noisy neighbors. One of the most famous accounts comes from a winter night in 2012. A ranger was doing a perimeter check of the DeChambeau house during a heavy snowfall. The house was locked from the outside. No footprints were in the snow. Yet, as he passed the window, he smelled the distinct heavy aroma of clove cigarettes and roasting meat. He looked inside, The house was empty and freezing, but the smell was so thick it made his eyes water. Research later revealed that the DeChambeau family was famous in the 1890s for their lavish holiday dinners. It seems that even in a town with no inhabitants, the memory of a celebration can become trapped in the wood, replaying itself when the mountain air reaches the right temperature. The Silent Sermon, a conclusion. Bodey stands today as a 500-acre monument to the American dream's shadow. We often celebrate the skyscrapers of New York or the lights of Hollywood, but Bodey is the other side of that coin. It is the story of what happens when the resources run out, when the boom becomes a bust, and when nature decides to move back in. As the sun sets over the Bodey Hills, the shadows of the leaning houses stretch out like long, dark fingers. The town doesn't feel dead, it feels suspended. It is waiting. Perhaps it's waiting for the price of gold to rise again, or perhaps it's waiting for the last nail to rust through so it can finally lay down and rest in the dust. For the visitor, the message is clear. Everything is temporary. The gold, the violence, the wealth, and the grief, all of it eventually settles into a quiet, sun-bleached peace. Goodbye, God, I'm going to Bodey. Maybe the little girl was wrong. Maybe God never left Bodey. He just stayed to watch the wind reclaim the mountain.